Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first ever episode of the U.S. Embassy Insider. Thanks to the wonderful success of our Facebook Live interview with Ambassador Kim in December and your requests for doing more, we have decided to start a regular interview called Embassy Insider. My name is Molly Koshina. I am the press attaché here at the Embassy, and I will be your host. Today, we're welcoming the chief of the Non-Immigrant Visa Unit, Martin, to answer all of your questions on non-immigrant visas. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Are you excited about your first Facebook Live interview?
I am, but the ambassador is going to be a hard act to follow, I think.
He is a hard act to follow, but I have faith that you are going to do great. When we were posting information about this Facebook Live session, all of our users had a ton of questions about non-immigrant visas. Now, in every country I've served in, visas are a top topic of conversation for everybody. And I think the Philippines is no different. Based on the response of our viewers, there's a lot of interest. They submitted a ton of questions. We'll start with the easy ones first and get more difficult. Will that be a good way to start?
Sure, although sometimes what looks easy isn't always an easy question.
That is true. So the first question we have from Charity Albero Villagracia. And it is actually a good place to start because she asks, can I please know the requirements of a non-immigrant visa? Sure.
Cherry, the requirements are pretty simple. They involve basically 4 steps. First, going online, filling out the DS-160 application form, making a payment through BPI for the visa fee, making an appointment for the interview with the consular officer, and then showing up on the day and time of your appointment and going through the interview process.
Can I ask a follow-on question?
Sure.
How early should people show up for their interview?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. We would really appreciate if applicants show up no more than 15 minutes before their interview.
Okay? That's it?
Exactly.
Okay.
There's no benefit to coming earlier. You're not going to be seen any faster. So please, 15 minutes is the best time.
I've heard that the long lines require early arrival. Is that not the case?
Nope. There are sometimes long lines. There's sometimes a lot of people who want visas, but you have an appointment time, and we're gonna take you in the order of your appointment time. So there's no need to get there any earlier.
Good to know. The next question comes from Lido Villegas. Lido says, the Philippines is a longtime ally, but why do you limit and impose restrictions on visa applications compared to other countries?
Okay, well, I don't know what other countries the questioner is asking about. Visa rules and regulations for other countries are something that I can't talk about specifically. However, I will say that there are no restrictions, and we have imposed no new rules on the visa process or the numbers of visas that we issue. Nothing has changed in the several months or years that I've been involved with the visa process.
Just my question, are the requirements the same in all countries for applying for and receiving a visa?
Generally, they're the same. In some specific countries, very few, there are additional requirements, but the Philippines is not one of those countries that's subject to those additional requirements. So they face no new requirements, no new changes, and pretty much the same requirements as every other country that we issue visas for.
Wonderful. The next question comes from at Sordo, Arizona. Do people have to bring bank statements for non-immigrant tourist visas? I will provide all expenses. Should they bring my bank statements?
Okay, so basically what the applicant seems to be asking is supplementary documents, or the questioner is asking about the applicant bringing supplementary documents.
Yeah, because it seems like this person is not the applicant.
Right.
Okay.
The quick answer to that is no. There's not a requirement to bring any supplemental document, whether it's someone who's going to be covering the costs for an applicant who's traveling, or whether it's the applicant themselves. The applicant coming with their passport and a complete and accurately completed DS-160, the electronic application form, is all that's normally required. There may, in some rare circumstances, be a question that can't readily be answered by an applicant, in which case supplemental information might be requested. But in the vast majority, something like 98% of the time, the interview is all that's necessary and no other documents need to be brought.
So, again, this is my question. What happens if someone in an interview didn't bring the documents and the consular officer wants to see them, that 2% of the people who need additional documents? What happens if they don't have them?
Okay. In that case, the application will be placed in a hold status. The consular officer will explain to the applicant what they need, what additional documents need to be provided. That will be written out on a form that we give to the applicant, telling them what they need to provide and how they need to provide it, and if any additional interview will be necessary.
Okay. The next question comes from Janeth Bronsi Swelto. Can senior citizens apply for a visa without appointments?
It's a good question. I know that here in the Philippines, senior citizens are entitled to a range of special discounts.
And I've seen priority lines. I think maybe...
Right. Exactly. Yeah. First, the bad news is that no, unfortunately, senior citizens have to pay the same fee that all other applicants have to pay. The good news is that certain senior citizens, if they need assistance, if they feel as though maybe they're not doing so well in the application process, the line waiting, sometimes the lines are long, that there's an expedited process to move them through the entire interview process a little quicker.
That is very, very helpful, especially with the heat.
Yeah, exactly.
I would imagine that would be really difficult. Okay, this next question comes from Carlos Vioria Salvador. If a U.S. citizen gives birth in the Philippines, is she able to go back to the U.S. with the baby?
Okay, it's a complicated question. It seems pretty simple on its face, but it implicates a couple of things. The non-immigrant visa process, for one, but more importantly, the first question is citizenship. And I would refer the questioner to my ACS colleagues.
What's ACS?
The American Citizen Services section of the consular section. They can better answer questions about whether or not a child receives citizenship at birth, being born of a U.S. citizen, whether one parent or two. But if, I'll try and sort of preempt the possible question there, if an applicant or a child in this case needs a visa, that's not going to be an immediate process. We're going to need to see documentation, and they're going to have to go through the application process. However, if the intent is to take the child to the United States to reside there, that's an immigrant visa situation. And here again, that's going to be something that is better handled by my colleagues in the immigrant visa unit.
You know, it really is complicated.
It can be, yeah.
Maybe that's why people have so many questions.
Questions, right.
Very difficult. Another one that seems to me, from what you just said, might fall under someone else's responsibility. This is from Angel Macean. If a U.S. citizen marries a Philippine citizen, can he immediately bring his wife to the United States with him? I guess kind of like having a baby, but a little different. But a little different.
A little different. unless the new wife is named Baby, perhaps.
There you go.
No. First off, it depends if the questioner is asking about getting married and then going for a short trip to the United States versus getting married and bringing their new wife or new husband to the United States to reside.
Not all wives, right?
Right.
Husbands sometimes want to travel.
So if it is the first part, they want to go on a short trip to the United States, the answer is that the new spouse would need to qualify for a visa. Okay, and that would be a temporary visa for a pleasure trip. Sometimes that can be difficult because there is likely the idea that there is an intention to move and reside in the United States permanently. However...
Why would there be an intention to move and reside in the United States?
Well, if the U.S. citizen spouse has come to the Philippines for the purposes of the marriage, but their work and their life is in the United States, that's the kind of scenario that we're talking about.
Interesting.
However, if there is a compelling showing under U.S. law that the ties of the couple are here in the Philippines, then it's impossible to get a non-immigrant visa for a short trip. If, however, as I said, they want to go and move to the United States, that's a longer process. That involves a petition with the Department of Homeland Security in the first stage. They adjudicate that petition, and then it goes to my colleagues in the IV section. And I would urge the questioner to refer to both the DHS website as well as our embassy website, specifically the IV section, for more information on that.
Okay. The next question is from Inadril Jayesh. I would like to know if I misspelled my name, if my name misspelled on the certificate of marriage will cause a 221G in an interview. First, what is a 221G?
Okay. The applicant is referring to a code that we use. That's the what we call the Quasi refusal code for an application that needs additional processing, whether there's missing documentation, missing information, something of that nature. In this case, it seems as though we're again talking about potential for an immigrant visa application.
It's a certificate of marriage, right?
Right, or a certificate of no marriage in this case. And so that's a certificate for the purposes of normally getting an immigrant visa. And in this case, I will say, while not specifically answering IV-related questions, that a document of that importance, if there's a misspelling of the name, then it's going to need to be corrected, and there's going to need to be a wait while the applicant gets a new certificate of no marriage.
Okay. What if somebody misspells their name on the application? Is that a problem?
No, we can correct that.
Okay.
So simple mistakes on our internal form made just by accident can be corrected, and without any kind of undue delay on the part of the applicant.
Okay, that's nice to know. This comes from Michael McMullen. When will the Philippines be granted visa waivers?
So, Michael, that's a great question. It's a really complicated question, and that's not something that...
Oh, it's only one line.
It's a simple question, but a complicated question in terms of answering, I should say. That's not something that is controlled here by the mission. That's a question for...
We can't decide that today
right.
during
No,
the Facebook
unfortunately
Live?
not. That's a question...
Sorry, Michael.
That's a question for the Philippine government basically the applicant pool of the Philippine government, Philippine citizens, to reach the requirements that need to be achieved in order to initially qualify. That is a very involved process, and that's not something that is easily achieved. So, Michael, I'm sorry, that's going to be a much longer issue to resolve.
Maybe for next month's Facebook Live.
Maybe.
This next question comes from Marlene Sarmiento de la Cruz. I was once denied for a tourist visa. Can I apply again? What do I need to do? And are there any new requirements?
Okay, I don't know when she was initially refused, so I don't know if there are new requirements. I rather suspect that there aren't any new requirements, because in the vast majority of years I've been doing this, there have been no additional new requirements. However, yes, the applicant can absolutely apply again if they've been denied a visa. I'm presuming that the denial was for an insufficient showing of ties compelling their return to the Philippines, what we call a 214B denial. Recently, we've been giving applicants blue letters. So if you've received a blue letter, that's...
Somebody in here has a blue letter.
Right.
Yes.
That's probably what kind of refusal she's talking about, or denial she's talking about. In that case, we would say that she can apply again. However, she needs to show that there's been a material change in her circumstances such that she now qualifies for a visa. And of course, those questions are only answered during an application process.
So a follow-on question of my own, is there a time frame for reapplication?
You mean a minimum, in which case they have to wait a certain amount of time?
Yeah.
No, they can...
So you said material change.
Right, exactly. They can, they're legally allowed to apply whenever they wish. However, if it's a recent refusal, anywhere from several weeks, unfortunately, sometimes we see several days, that's not going to result in a different circumstance or a different outcome. But for several weeks or several months, it's going to be a rare event where someone has had a set of meaningful changes to their circumstances that's going to allow an interviewing officer to reach a different conclusion. In most cases, we're talking several months or years, before material changes have happened such that an applicant will qualify when they've previously been denied.
Okay. It's interesting. So if a material change is, for example, today I don't have any money in my bank account and tomorrow I have a lot of money in my bank account, does that qualify?
No, because, because we don't look at one particular circumstance. It's the totality of what the applicant presents in their application and their interview. So just merely having money, just merely having a trip, just merely having a job, not one single thing is going to make an applicant qualify for a visa where they didn't qualify before.
You look at the whole picture.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, the next question comes from June Ann Asuelo, and she's actually writing to us from Lebanon. She says, I'm here right now in Beirut working as a domestic helper. I'm returning home through the United States in June. I want to apply for a U.S. visa to visit a friend, but I'm worried I might get denied. Is there advice on how I can get a U.S. visa, or is there a transit visa?
Okay. The answer to both questions is yes, you can get a visa. Yes, there's a transit visa. Let's start with the simple or the first part of the question. The applicant has to show, or this particular questioner has to show, like any other applicant, that she qualifies for the visa. So whether she does that as a matter of being an overseas foreign worker, whether she does that as a matter of being here employed in the Philippines, or not employed for that matter, she has to meet those same basic qualifications.
So irrespective of whether she's applying in Lebanon or applying in the Philippines, same qualifications.
Right. I would suggest that now the applicants can certainly apply for a visa in Lebanon. However, I would say that it's going to be somewhat difficult for my colleagues in the embassy in Lebanon to make a determination about her ties to the Philippines, or in fact her ties to another country from Lebanon, because she's not a resident, or she's a resident only for the purposes of her work visa. So that's going to be a little difficult for her to accomplish, but not necessarily impossible. If she has the necessary background and circumstances, she can qualify. I would suggest that it's probably easier and better for her to consider returning to the Philippines from her overseas work assignment and apply here in the Philippines. Now, that's no guarantee that she's going to qualify for the visa, but we are better placed to judge her ties as a Philippine citizen to the Philippines from here.
Well, and I guess that begs the question, if she's living in Lebanon but trying to demonstrate ties in the Philippines.
Right. It's the same for any person living and working in one country and trying to demonstrate ties to their home country. It's very difficult for a U.S. embassy or U.S. consulate to make those kinds of determinations in lots of circumstances. Now, her second question had to do with the possibility of a transit visa. A transit visa, in most cases, the applicant has to meet the exact same qualifications as they do for a B1, B2 visa. So there's no real difference in what they have to show. But there is a transit visa. That's for generally an uninterrupted trip through the United States. So because we don't have a transit lounge system in the United States like they do in European countries. So the visa that they need is essentially to allow them to come in from one flight, do a transfer to another flight, maybe if they have to overnight for a day or so, especially if they're going to be joining, let's say, a cruise ship, for example. That's what the transit visa is used for. And so then they would have to continue their journey, whether back to the Philippines or to another country.
But it's the same qualifications.
Same. You have to pay, you have to fill out the DS-160, you have to pay your application fee, and you have to go for the interview. And generally speaking, the qualifications are the same. Which is, you have to show that you have such compelling circumstances in your life that are going to make you leave the United States and return either, in the case of the questioner, to Lebanon, a third country, or back to the Philippines.
Fascinating. Next question comes from James Barrett. I'm a U.S. citizen living in the Philippines. Can I bring my girlfriend to the U.S. for vacation?
Okay. James is probably not meaning can he do it, because that's a question for James, but will James's fiance, or girlfriend in this case, get a visa? Here again, as I've responded to some of your earlier questions, the applicant, in this case the questioner's girlfriend, has to show us by her application and her interview that she has such ties to the Philippines that will compel her to return. So some of the things that we look at are family ties, work ties, whether or not there are compelling ties outside the Philippines that may make you go to another country versus those ties that would make you stay in the United States. So that's what we're looking at. And so in the case of the questioner, the girlfriend is going to have to demonstrate that she would return to the Philippines at the end of her trip to the United States.
That ties in with the next question very, very closely. And so I'm just going to go straight into this. It says, my fiance wanted to visit me in the U.S. for a few weeks. So this is a U.S. citizen who's writing. We couldn't apply for a fiance visa because we didn't have plans to get married yet. But she applied for a tourist visa and was denied, even though she had the letter of invitation from me, the person, as well as other documentation of my bank statements, my assuring that I will take care of everything up to the last day. Why was she denied?
Okay, once again, I wasn't involved in this particular adjudication. I can only make some educated guesses based on what the questioner says. First off, let's talk about the documentation. As I said, it's not required. It's only going to be looked at, it's only going to be really useful if the officer can't get an answer or can't get an understandable answer from the questions that he or she asks of an applicant. In the case that the questioner asks, once again, the ties making the fiancé, even though they're not in a position to get married at this time, make them leave the United States after a short trip and come back to the Philippines. It's those compelling ties that really are going to be a key in these types of circumstances. And family issues, work issues, those types of things versus the intention of these two to eventually get married and live together. Now, that is presumed to be, again, in the United States because of the fact that the questioner is based in living in the United States. So that has to be that has to be overcome. And that is oftentimes a difficult thing to do.
It would be. And so it goes also back to the qualifications of the applicant, not of the person in the U.S., because the person in the U.S. is not applying for the visa.
Exactly.
It has to, So.
And that's a fair point that you bring up, and one that sometimes people miss. It's not, we're not judging the family in the United States. We're not judging, we're not looking at them. We are only looking at the applicant. So again, his bank statements are not going to be very helpful.
Okay. This question comes from Keto Peiko. What are the possible ways I can visit my father in the United States? He petitioned for me to immigrate, but I'm still on the wait list.
Okay.
So this is a IV, but
it's an IV question,
pending IV, yeah?
Right. It's an IV question, generally, and I don't know where, what type of application that is pending and where the situation is in terms of the questioner's qualifications, in terms of age especially. But the real question is, will the questioner be able to achieve an NIV while he's waiting to go to the United States? Unfortunately, this is going to be pretty difficult because U.S. law presumes that everyone who's applying for a non-immigrant visa intends to go and stay in the United States. And so the applicants have to show, this is why the compelling circumstances are so important, the applicant has to show that they will overcome that they will really come back. In this case, it's going to be really difficult because there is the immigrant visa petition out there, meaning that there is an intent to go and live in the United States as an immigrant. So it's going to be difficult, but it's not impossible.
Okay, that's interesting. This question comes from Queen Itang. My grandfather is an American citizen. Is there any possibility for us to use his citizenship to apply for a visa?
It's an interesting question. The answer to this is no, simply because we don't look at your relatives' considerations or circumstances such as citizenship when looking at a visa application and the qualifications of that applicant. So there's no purpose, there's no reason to consider the American citizen grandfather or any other relative. So the applicant has to stand on his or her own qualifications.
Okay. Next question comes from July. July, it looks like, wants to be a student. She writes, do I need to pass an admissions exam first for a U.S. school before I can apply for a student visa?
Okay. So the student visa, the F visa, is a process that involves a couple of steps. That's one of those visas that involves more than just filling out an application form, paying the fee, and showing up for the interview. You need to have what's called a DS 2019 form, a 2019 form, and that's issued by the educational institution.
By the U.S. school.
Right. And so in that case, the school is going to have to issue that. They're only going to be doing that after they've admitted a student.
Got it. And so it really depends on what the school requires for the student.
Right.
So the admissions question really is a question for the school.
In a way, but it's virtually certain that there's going to have to be some form of admission by the educational institution. And the same is also true for people going for vocational education on an M-class visa.
Oh.
They need to have the same type of decision by the, or acceptance by the entity that's going to be providing their education.
Interesting. Well, for July, and for any other folks who might want information about student visas, we have a consular officer who will be available to answer your student-related questions at the Education USA Fair on February 7th. You can get more information on our Facebook page about how to register for this free event. Let's see. We have a couple more questions. How are you doing?
Fine.
You hanging in there?
Sure.
You don't have to run?
Nope, we're good.
Okay. So this one comes from Monali Nara. Once an applicant is denied, is it okay to ask the consul the reason for denial? Would there be a chance to get a short stay visa? These are two questions, actually. Sorry.
Okay.
Would there be a chance to get a short stay visa even if we have family in the United States? So, reason for denial and then short stay visa. I've never heard of that.
Well, let me answer the second question first. We don't have a visa category or a visa type called a short stay visa.
Okay.
So an applicant who qualifies receives, generally speaking, a full validity visa, which here in the Philippines is 10 years. So we look at the same types of considerations, the same types of facts, the same type of background for applicants, for those wanting to go for a brief period of time, 2 weeks, 10 days, as those who want to go for several months at a time. Now, with respect to the first part of the question, which has to do with the denial and the reason the denial was made or the reason the decision was reached, the officer will, in all cases where we deny an applicant a visa, where they fail to qualify for some reason or they have an ineligibility, we give them a written explanation. It's very brief. It's not intended to answer all questions. It's intended just to let them know the reasons, the basic reasons for why they were refused a visa, and to provide them with a starting point for some information where they can go and do some research on their own, or in some cases seek some assistance. Perhaps if they have a medical ineligibility, they can take that up. But they can always ask the adjudicating officer the reason for the decision. However, as a lot of the applicants will see, and if they haven't been through the visa process already, there's a lot of people waiting for visas, and the adjudicating officers have a really short period of time to be able to get into discussions with the applicants. So it's going to be a very brief exchange, and it's going to really refer the applicant back to the letter that they received, whether it's the blue form that we talked about earlier, or whether it's a different type of ineligibility or decision.
And then they'd have to come back depending on...
Sometimes they may get that 221G initial refusal. That's a hold, and then they'll have to come back again. So,
but the blue form gives them the reasons.
The blue form explains in one side in English and on the other side in Tagalog the reason for the refusal, which basically comes down to the fact that they didn't have, or they weren't able to show, those compelling ties that would make them leave the United States and return to the Philippines.
Got it. We're running out of time. We're not going to hit all the questions, but I did want to hit a few that we had duplicates on. At Christina Miss John, I was only asked 2 questions, and the interviewer did not even look at my supporting documents. Why?
Okay. As I said earlier, those supporting documents aren't always looked at, because they're only going to be looked at when there's something that isn't clear from either the application or the interviewees, the applicants' answers or responses. So that's the reason why those supporting documents weren't looked at. Sometimes we look at them, sometimes we don't, but it's a rare occurrence that we do. Now, as to the 2 questions, here again, I wasn't there. It's not impossible to make a decision if the applicant fills out a complete application form and responds to a couple of simple questions directly, to only ask a very few number of questions. But I'm pretty confident that the applicant was asked more than 2 questions. I do understand it's a stressful situation, and applicants sometimes sort of gloss over questions that they've been asked or forget during the stress of the application. And of course, if the applicant was refused, they're naturally disappointed. So they sometimes forget questions that they were asked.
I'm just curious, how many visa interviews do you guys do in a day?
Well, right now we're doing very close to 1,000 a day. And so the officers have a lot of work to do. And that's another reason why they can't take a lot of time to have back and forth discussions with applicants.
1,000 is a lot. That
yeah.
really is. Okay, last question.
Okay.
We had 2 questions that were similar to this, so I want to make sure we get to it. This comes from Tony Sutton, and he says, I'm a 20-year-old, I'm a retired Air Force veteran with 20 years of service. I have tried to get my caregiver a visa to accompany me to Hawaii for medical treatment, but the visa was denied. Can caregivers get visas to accompany citizens to travel to the United States?
Okay. The quick short answer is yes. Caregivers can get visas. What we're looking at in the type of situation that Tony is asking about is a B1 domestic visa.
Okay.
That's intended for people who are accompanying travelers, whether they're American citizens or dual nationals, perhaps, who need to have some type of assistance while they're in the United States for a short period of time. But those Americans intend to depart the United States, at least at the time that they apply for the visa. So yes, the caregiver can get a B1 domestic visa. Generally, they have to show the exact same qualifications as a B1, B2, the business pleasure type visa applicants. However, they also have to provide some additional documentation. One of those things is a proper contract. So it has to meet the requirements that the U.S. government sets out. And we have on our webpage, we have a form contract that sets out in minimal form or minimal way the information that's required. The big things are it has to talk about the minimum wage for where the caregiver is going to be going in the United States. So that means
Hawaii,
that right, and it can vary depending on what cities or counties you're going to, and so that's an important consideration to understand. There are a couple.
So the minimum wage at the U.S. destination, not in the Philippines.
Right. It has nothing to do with what either the minimum wage is here, what they pay their employee here or their caregiver
it's all
here.
About there.
It's all about in the United States.
That's fascinating. Is that U.S. law?
Yeah. And we can't get around that, and so that has to be a principal consideration when they're going to be completing the application form and submitting to the interview. So they need to bring that with them.
And that is on the website.
There's a form, and it's an exemplar form. Okay. It doesn't have to be followed exactly, but it does set out the basic requirements. And I should say that the caregiver needs to be able to understand what's written in that contract. So if they only speak Tagalog, they're going to need to have a translation if the contract is in Tagalog so that we can look at it. And we're going to be asking the caregiver questions about the contract so that they can demonstrate that they understand what's in it and what their rights are.
Because they would have signed the contract, right?
Yes.
Right. Fascinating. So caregivers can get visas, but there are things to keep in consideration.
Sure.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time. Martin, thank you so very much for joining us. I think that you answered a ton of our questions, and I'm sure that our Facebook viewers really appreciate your time, your patience, and the explanation that you gave to every single one of the answers. One last question. If there are additional questions, where can our Facebook viewers go to get more information?
The first place I would encourage them to go to is the website travel.state.gov. There is a whole range of information there. There is a visa wizard process that they can go through to try and determine which visa they need for their purposes. And it provides links to other sites and information that they'll need. If that information doesn't provide them with the level of response that they need, they can write to our web address, our email address, which is cons, C-O-N-S, Manila, N-I-V, at state.gov, and we can respond to more direct questions that way.
Super. We will be sure to put that email address up on our Facebook page to share with all of our fans. So to our viewers, thank you very much for joining us today. Stay in touch. Follow our Facebook page, follow Ambassador Kim's Twitter and our Embassy Twitter to learn about upcoming Facebook Lives, new events, activities, contests, and all sorts of information from us here at the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly.
It was so fun.